Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing? Okay, we have a couple more coming in. Well, welcome everyone to the Geospatial Forum. My name is Georgina Sanchez. I am a research scholar with the Center for Geospatial Analytics, and together with my PhD student, Margaret Lorrimore, we are delighted to present our host, our speaker today, Scott Reinhard. Scott is a proud graduate from the College of Design, our own College of Design. Yeah. Yes, there you go. And he found a passion for GIS. In fact, here within the boundaries of the College of Natural Resources, he took his first class Intro to GIS with FER. So maybe an applause for FER as well. We have some FER as well. Scott is today with the New York Times. He's a graphic editor with the New York Times, and today he's going to be talking about how we can use GIS visualization to tell better, more exciting stories. If you please can help me welcome Scott. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to come back to Raleigh. I loved my time at NC State, and I miss it here. And thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I took an Intro to GIS class in my last semester that I was here, and it kind of changed my life unexpectedly, and I'm really glad I did that. Yeah, so I'm a graphics editor at the New York Times. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that today. I always pack in too much, but I'll get through it. And I would love, I mean, if you want to ask questions at the end, I would love that. So yeah, like I just said, I'm a graphics editor at the New York Times. I sit on the graphics desk, which is a group of about around 50 individuals. And that's not all cartographers or all GIS people, but there's probably a core group of 7 or 8 of us as cartographers on the team. But then also we have other editors and reporters and technologists, and we work on our own stories. We work with other desks. It's a highly, highly, highly collaborative team of very, very nice people, which is great. I took a kind of circuitous route to get to the New York Times. My background's in graphic design. I have an undergraduate and graduate degree in graphic design. Like was said earlier, I graduated from the College of Design with my master's in graphic design. Previous to coming to Raleigh, I was in Chicago for about 8 years, and I worked a lot of that time there. I worked at the Museum of Contemporary Art as a graphic designer there. And then after leaving Raleigh, I worked at the New York Design Studio 2x4, which, if you don't know their work, you should look it up. It's a really wonderful place. So I've had some prompts that I heard the other speakers who are coming through are answering to, and so I wanted to include in those, how has your career trajectory led you to using geospatial perspective? I mean, a little bit of what I just described to you, but also I won in 6th grade the elementary school geography bee. And like, there's a photo and I really remember it's from like 1996. So like, I'm like dressed really grunge and it's very cool, but I can't find it. But I will one day, and that'll be great. But like I said, I worked at the MCA in Chicago, and that was a very, I don't know what the word is, formative experience for me as a designer. It was a small team of people in-house. Things needed to get done. A lot of things needed to get done. A lot of different types of people, projects, curators, artists that I was working with. And I think that, like, in a funny way, like pairs up really well with what I do now at the Times. One of the things I love doing there, and just love in general, is book design. The thing I really like about book design, and I'll skip ahead to this, I really like this. This is all the books I designed while I was there, is that the form of the book, I thought deeply about that. And I think you can see this with this visualization. It changed a lot, right? Based on like what the book was about, and the impetus behind the show, or artist's work, or curator's vision, or what have you. And like, I was always like trying to find what is the best way to package that content or that idea into some sort of form. And I maybe just like keep that in mind as I go through the work at the Times too, because there's a lot of different stories and data, things that need to be visualized. Like I'm thinking about that all the time. What's the best way to have someone who's going to look at this, who might not know anything about it, connect with it in some way? So this was very formative for me. But then after leaving the MCA and working for a little bit on my own, I wasn't ready to kind of get narrowed down to being like museum person or book person or, whatever, or print like, I don't know, like in the graphic design world, you kind of get narrowed in on these things, these specialties. I felt not ready to be whatever that person yet. And so I came to NC State, and I just loved it because I had that 8 years of working, and then that 2 years of like, oh my gosh, I have time and space and resources and great people and no consequences. I can just make stuff, and like, sure, you get grades, but I like never looked at any of the grades I got because it just didn't matter. It was like, this is time I had given myself, I had blocked it out, and it was a real gift. And so I just got in the practice of like learning as much as I could. Everything. I just like wanted to learn to code. I wanted to learn to do 3D stuff. I wanted to laser cut everything. And so these are just some of the things that I would make for myself. And I think what that was, that I started to get into the habit of just making to make, and with no goal in mind for no one else except myself. I took away, and that was an excuse to learn new things, to push things, to see what's possible, maybe aesthetically, formally, that kind of thing. But it really got me in a practice of kind of uninterrupted making and thinking, and that continues on. The thing that kind of happened, I'll come back in a second, but the thing I really loved that kind of happened was eventually, right, I had all these like tracks of exploration, like, yeah, GIS kind of came into play at a certain point, but they started to overlap, and they started to like come together and then create new things that might not have existed, prior. And that was pretty cool. That was really cool. I included this was like one of the first GIS things I ever did, was like a class assignment. I don't even know what we're looking at anymore, but I do know I laser cut it because I had a laser cutter at my disposal, and I missed that. And I love this. This was the final project in the Intro to GIS class I took. And I knew, it was my last semester, I knew I was moving to New York City. And so I was like, I want to find the best place for me to live, for me and my wife. I'm happy to report that the building, I had certain parameters. It has to be within a park and by a grocery store and within 3 miles of Manhattan, et cetera, et cetera. I'm happy to report that the building, the place we found to live and still live in, is like one of these buildings, which is kind of cool. Yeah. So like, thank you, GIS. But like I said, like after, so there was like this period of about 3 years after I moved to New York, 2.5 years or so, where I had this new tool, these new tools to play with. And then I have data that is just like free and available to anybody to use, and I just was like, kind of like with the other stuff I was just showing, like having fun with it. I had no particular connection to cartography or GIS. It wasn't relevant to my daily work. It was really just a tool for making, for kind of form and image making. at that time. And so I was just kind of going wild and learning. Like, I think that's the other thing too, is I'm from the Midwest, and like I always thought the landscape of the Midwest was like really boring. And then I started working with raster data, and like you can like see the effects of the glaciers like in the landscape just from elevation data. That was really apparent. I think that was like the first thing where it like started to click for me that like, whoa, the past is still present and it's super, super visible just in the elevation of the landscape that we're in. And so I just, anyways, like had 2-3 years of just fun and exploration and making. And the thing too, I think for y'all to remember is like when you make things, like you don't have to show anybody, and there's no consequences to making something really ugly or really bad. Like that's a good skill to kind of foster and to be comfortable with. It's just to make with no particular goal in mind. I think that's like a nice practice to foster a bit, because it turns into things. Maybe you might not have a purpose in this very moment, but what you're also doing is you're just kind of like building this vocabulary that certainly comes into play at one point or another. I know that happens all the time for me at the Times too, where I'll just make things, or I'll start something and it sits on the shelf for maybe a year or 2 years, and then just like finds its way. But like I said, I started just connecting. So I was like doing GIS, and then the 3D kind of started to come together, or like elevation data plus coding. This was done in processing and in 3D, and so like those threads just started to weave together, and then that's where things happened that wouldn't otherwise have happened, previously. So there's just elevation data. I think the thing too, like my general conclusion is like you can abstract something to death, and I think you can still kind of see, always like still see it. I think we're so visually attuned that we can always still see it. Another thing that happened, this is just like another thread. This is the lake my grandparents had a lake house on, and I grew up going to. And I love history and I love maps, like we all do. And it just occurred to me one day, like, oh, this is that map from 1961 of the lake. And what if I'm working in 3D now? Like, what if I paired that map and this kind of 3D data and put it together? And that was another kind of aha moment. It just like popped for me, like, wow, I have a different understanding of this place that means so much to me. I have a new understanding of what that actually looks like and what it feels like. And that like pairing just like led to other forms, and so it kind of occurred to me, oh, cool, that was me like outlining by hand contours and then putting it into Blender or whatever. What if I took elevation data and maps and put those together, right? And that was like another aha. And this was like 2018. I started making these, and this has become kind of a ubiquitous form. And I'm sure you've seen many of these types of things, but this is something that that came to me through that process of exploration, of putting different types of things together and just trying like, what if I did this, or what if I did that, and like kind of that came together. And I still do them, and I still really like them. And I've started to use AI to, zoom in on parts of old maps and that kind of thing, or use LiDAR data and parts of old maps, and it's endless. It goes on and on and on, but like that kind of thing, those explorations, they were kind of getting out into the world, and I was starting to get commissions, and people were calling on me to do some work for them, and so that work kind of trickled out into the world. This was a 3-story tall visualization I did at Beloit College for the Architect Genie Gang. This was I'd say an aesthetic feat, but also a technical feat. The file for this was 160 gigabytes. It's printed at 300 DPI. So that leads me to the New York Times. So I was just going about my life, being a graphic designer. And then at the end of 2018, I got an email from my now colleague Larry Buchanan, who just came out with like one of the coolest stories of the New York neighborhood map. I don't know if you all saw that, it ran this week. Unbelievable. Anyways, he emailed me and just said, hey, like we've seen on the graphics desk, we've seen your work. Would you like to come by the Times and talk shop, you know? And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll come by the New York Times and talk shop about maps, you know? And then I went the next day and went to the newsroom and met with Larry and my now boss Archie and Archie's boss, who's on the masthead. And I think it quickly like became clear that like this was more than just like talking shop, you know, that this was kind of an interview, but that was okay because like I wasn't nervous because I wasn't expecting it. And so I started to work there in January 2019. This was the first story I worked on, actually. There was a dam that had burst in Brazil. It was a mining dam, and it flooded a valley and killed a lot of people. And this was, yeah, like one of the first, I'd say, geospatial analysis that I did was looking at where these dams are and where populated areas are and where these dams are kind of upstream of populated areas. And kind of throughout 2019, I kind of learned the ropes of being a graphics editor, a journalist, a reporter, and frankly, working with GIS in a day-to-day basis, right? So it was like a steep learning curve. But I think that's also the part of my job is like, it's just learning constantly. And that's something I really love about it. But, you know, to my boss's credit, he like really took a chance on me of coming from a different field with a particular expertise, but coming into a new field. And you know, that was a risk, you know, because I was an unknown entity, I'd say. One of the cool things, though, about being a graphics editor is we're not just like a service department for other desks. We are editors, right? So we can generate stories as well. And so I generated this story. I came up with this story, pitched it. It was before the Whitney Biennial, which is the Whitney Museum of American Art. Every 2 years has a biennial. It's the best American artists are in the show, generally. And this has been going on since the 30s. I realized by looking at old exhibition catalogs that they used to, up until 1975, include the artist's home address. And, you know, and that's like, boom, that's data, right? That's like location data. And not just any location data, it's like the best artists at the peak of their career at that given time. You know, and so I pitched it like, whoa, what if we like mapped the Whitney Biennial since the 30s, you know, and after the 70s, it was just their city, but that's still useful data to have as well. And so we were able to see where the center of the art world in the United States was. We're also able to see like where in particular cities artists lived. You know, and so it was, I think Manhattan was amazing. You could see the centers of the art world in Manhattan kind of shift downtown, and then over to Brooklyn and that kind of thing. But that was, you know, we get to work on kind of a real variety of stories, and this is something I really quite love. It was really special to be able to like marry my work in art as well as GIS and graphic design, that kind of thing. So yeah, I worked on and off, or like kind of freelance throughout 2019. In January 2020, my boss got in touch with me and said, hey, there's this pandemic coming. What are you doing the next few months? You know, that kind of thing. And I said, yeah, sure. You know, he said, we're going to need all hands on deck. We need help. And so I came back to the Times March 11th, 2020. And I've been there since. And my task, I worked on the COVID tracker. And I was doing a very specific thing. I was on we had a small group of people that just would publish the tracker. And what that just meant was we would kind of communicate with the data folks, communicate with the technology folks. Everything good? We ready? And then kind of run the scripts to pull in all of the current data, rebuild all the pages, and publish to the homepage, and then it kind of expanded. We're doing that multiple times a day. At the beginning of the pandemic, 7 days a week. And I got to witness that tracker, which turned into a piece of national infrastructure in a way. I got to see that from sub 1,000 cases, I think, to the tens of millions, and the technology that we had to build in the background to accommodate all that data, which was really fascinating, and all those things. This is a type of project we work on like pretty consistently at the time. So the prior year there's a measles outbreak, and this is a similar thing. We would just call county health department and say, okay, get updates on that, and and plot it and update it. And that's kind of what we thought the COVID tracker would be. It obviously wasn't. It turned into something far greater. It was a part of a Pulitzer Prize in public service for the Times. I worked on that for about 1.5 years before going on to other stuff. We made the data public. And then there was many stories that wasn't just data-based, but it was, people-based as well. And so this was like one of the early epicenters of COVID in New York City, and about the people kind of in these neighborhoods. And I used maps here kind of more in an emotional way of showing density and kind of evoking a feeling about a place, communicating through maps. And this was my first A1, which is the cover of the New York Times, where New Yorkers fled to during the pandemic, during the early pandemic, I should say. Same, yeah, this is just an interior spread. They all went to the Hamptons. Another thing I did was every day at 5 o'clock, I stopped what I was doing and I made the COVID hotspot map, and I made about 250 of those. And that was it was all sobering. It was all a real sobering ritual to do every day, among other things. I work a lot in, I don't know how I'm calling this physical world, but like climate change, natural disasters, natural phenomenon, that kind of thing. This was a breaking news map that I made for the Turkey earthquake earlier in the year. And yeah, the aftershocks and the main earthquakes. And the things we do, I guess I should describe, like, we work on so many different types of things, but also at like different time scales too. So like we'll work on, well, if something happens in the world, I can get a map up on the site in 5 minutes, right? Dot on a map and publish. Or there'll be something like this, which, it happens, and then by the end of the day, I'll have a map like this assembled and ready to publish. But then, there's like a week. Let's see if this is going to work. Yeah, it is. Maybe a week where we start to do some analysis. Some of the satellite data might start coming in. There might be some cloudless days, and we're able to get some images of what's happening on the ground. That might be a week out. We do a few days of analysis and like real painstaking staring closely at satellite imagery, seeing which buildings are determining that. So we'll do that reporting ourselves. And then a few weeks out, some of them, oops, sorry, one moment. Some of that more, this was not satellite data, this was aerial imagery, so probably most likely drone imagery, and of the devastation. And so it's just, as we get more and more data and information and understanding of what's going on, we're able to present our work in different ways. And every piece along that's okay too, right? It's like the form that something takes is based on the time and what you know about it too, what you know and what you can verify. And so this was, we had actually in a version of this that got cut is we had some kind of like machine learning analysis based on satellite data of damaged buildings that we were using that was provided to us, and we realized that like it just wasn't doing it, and we couldn't verify that data. And then we got access to this aerial imagery, and it's like, oh, this is way more visceral and really gives you a sense of just like the devastation and destruction that happened in Turkey. And then I'd say, and I haven't included this, but then we sent a colleague to Turkey, and he got drone imagery, and then we did kind of even a more kind of in-depth and in the place story. So we really cover stories from different timescales, and that's quite interesting to see that happen in different ways. I love this one too. This was a simple like data set, simple of just a collection of shape files, which I guess I could have just mapped statically, but I think what was really cool, this is deforestation in the Amazon. And through animating it, I started to see behavior, appear. You could start to see like why deforestation happens. You have these strips of roads or whatever where people are on, and then they kind of continually, move in and clear forests. I don't know if that would have been apparent without animating it. I love remote imaging or remote sensing. This was one weekend in September, I think 2021, where just like the whole West Coast went up in flames. And like these wildfires were so massive. Like the one on the upper right, when it appears, was 100 miles tall, and I wanted to animate that, and they were at a scale that were so big that I could use data from the GOES satellite, which is a geostationary satellite that sits 22,000 miles out and is taking an image and reading every 10 minutes. Generally, that would be too coarse, like spatially, to use. I think it's every 4 kilometers each pixel. I think, don't quote me on that. But because the scale of these were so big, I could animate that data. And I think what's pretty interesting to me is that you can see a wildfire, like you generally just see smoke, but you can see it. And then also, like, even though these are like a grid of abstract circles, it still feels like fire. And I think that's kind of profound in a way, that fire is fire, regardless of what scale it's at. I guess that sounds simple, but that blew my mind in a way. This is also the department of how do we have access to this data? Lightning data. We work with a company that provides us lightning strike data down to the microsecond. They can tell us if it was cloud to cloud or cloud to ground, and obviously the location information as well. And so, like, this was a story about why there were all these wildfires happening in the West that summer, and lightning was part of that. And so I just had the opportunity to animate lightning data. And I think what's cool about this map too is I created it in a 3D environment, right? So it's like in Blender. So the elevation is digitally an elevation, and then each lightning strike, I just had like a light essentially at that location, like flash. And so I really like how it is like in the environment in a way. And so this is a map, but also there's other things happening, and I like playing with that as well. I think that was really kind of cool. This was a story that we worked on. A researcher that we worked with was shooting a radar beam at wildfires. The wildfires are getting so big that they're creating their own weather systems, which then makes the wildfires bigger and that kind of thing. But because he had been taking these slices, we were able to take that data and recreate it into 3D. So big they have their own lightning storms, that kind of thing. But pretty amazing to be able to take a wildfire and see its growth, see the different parts of its anatomy kind of come out. This was really and then we with our storytelling, add graphics to explain like what's happening. There was like text too that as you scrolled through. Same fire. I think the one on the right, I also like too, same deal. It's kind of in the environment. And so I had the fire like lighting the environment, which was kind of interesting. But like the trick with this one is like, how do you show scale on something, on a wildfire that's 70 miles wide, you know? Do you make it really big? I think, do you make it really small, right? And once you kind of show like state, you know, California state level, and then I think this one's more effective. It's like, it feels like half the state almost, you know, in width. This was a series of fires in the Pantanal wetlands in Brazil, Paraguay, and Bolivia, which are like this area that don't burn, they're wetlands, you know? And so this was like really a frightening situation happening there. Remote sensing data as well. When the volcano in Tonga exploded, I'm proud of this one because this was I had this one up and published within 24 hours of the volcano exploding. Same lightning data set, 400,000 lightning strikes that we had access to animate. And then I also overlaid it onto GOES satellite data, that's satellite imagery. But like, I mean, you all know this, I'm talking to people who know this, but like, how cool is it that like this volcano on the other side of the world exploded? That's not cool, that was terrible. But we're sitting on the other side of the world, and with 24 hours, like we have access to be able to have this kind of understanding of a volcano. Like we do some magic, you know, like that seems like magic to me. I think that's really cool. This is not a natural disaster, but it kind of felt like one when the explosion in Beirut a few years ago. This was a daily, we call them daily when we do it during the, you know, over the course of just one day, kind of breaking news type of thing. But we also wanted to have a sense of like, how many people are going to be impacted by this, this event, you know? And so we took population density data and did a rough analysis of, you know, at different radius or, you know, away from the explosion, just to kind of get an understanding of like, what is the effect and what's happened here. I just love, again, I just love the GOES satellites. Sometimes when there's like a hurricane, instead of every 10 minutes, they'll do a reading every minute, right? And so you get like the one on the left. So you can get these absolutely beautiful animations of these storms. And I guess I should say, just caveat, like this is all like really tragic stuff. And so my excitement is more just about in the data realm and not in the human realm. This is like terribly tragic stuff. Tornado data. This was about like a 260-mile stretch of tornado that ripped through 4 states. I just like, even whether it's animated or static, I'm really trying to, again, what's the form that like you can connect with, that you can understand, and that appropriately communicates the scale of what went on and what happened, and then also like what is the data set that can help us achieve that goal. You know, I really liked this one because it was like, yes, there was a data set associated with it, but it was like a bit of just thinking about it, like kind of like looking at the geography of the area and then looking at what happened. This was a like heavy rainfall event that happened kind of high up in Tennessee, and there's these like real deep valleys, and they all got flooded with flash floods, and it was like, I think a few dozen people lost their lives. And it just, you know, we were reporting, okay, like there was damage here and damage here. And then we kind of like just took a step back and like looked at the landscape and, you know, realized that these like deep valleys, and then I overlaid the rainfall data on top of it. And it just, that it kind of clicked like, oh, wow, yeah, high up, 17 inches of rainfall happened in a very short amount of time. Like, no wonder it all kind of came down these creeks. But that was just like a little bit of reporting, some data, and then just, me trying to understand, how does this all fit together? What actually happened here? Sometimes a data set isn't just going to tell you that. You just have to like sit and think about it a little bit. This is from this summer when New York City, and many other locations, but when it happens in New York City, then everyone freaks out, and so the New York Times has to cover it. But when we're having the wildfire smoke, this was I took daily. I added up all the smoke data per day, just to get a sense of where the smoke had been and where it was going. Okay, so that's the kind of natural world. I work in the human world also. This was the first map of the January 6th insurrection that appeared in the New York Times. And I set this probably at 5 o'clock on January 6th. And I include this because, kind of what I was talking about with timescale. This isn't a geospatial analysis, I know, but it is data, right? These are data points. This is what we knew at the time. And I think I like showing this because that's like a document of when we know more, we show more. But when this is what we know at this particular time that we can verify, this is what we show. And I think I like, showing how simple this is, because that was our understanding at the moment. And then our understanding grew, and our stories and our coverage expanded because of that. This was the shift in votes in the 2020 election. I think this was a particularly interesting design problem to solve. There's the classic kind of like red, blue, land doesn't vote, all that kind of thing. And I was like really interested in having an understanding of what the 2020 election outcome was. How did it shift? But then I didn't want to over or underweight different areas. And so I feel like if I had one symbol that was just percentage shift, it would probably overweight areas where there aren't that many people, right? So if you have, 50 people in a county, or I'm just making that up, and 10 votes change, that's a big percentage, versus if you have a couple 100,000 in the city and 10,000 votes change, that's super small. I wanted to take percentage and raw vote totals into account. And so I like really asked a lot of arrows here. I used the length of the arrow, but also the width of the arrow. So the length was percentage, right? So if there was a big percent shift, I wanted to see that, but I wanted to maybe give the mass to the amount of raw vote totals, right? So say, for instance, in Dallas, there's a decent sized shift in percentage, but there's a lot that represents a lot of votes. So I wanted to like visually give that a lot of mass. Whereas down here, on the border in Texas, there's a big shift, but that represents like, I think, far fewer like raw votes. And so this was me trying to get it like visually some sort of, I don't want to say balance. It's not me striving for balance. It's me trying to have a clear picture, I'd say, and weighting things maybe appropriately in how they're portrayed. But it was really kind of I think, an interesting form to work with in this area. And then I did it for 2008 as well as 2016. I learned a lot. I didn't know that. This was a map I made for the house control shifting. It's a totally different form. Just uses a z-axis instead of arrows. The pullout of or the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. over a number of months, as well as, kind of those few days when people are trying to leave Kabul. We work a lot with satellite imagery, and just kind of explaining and showing, where things are at and the context of events that are happening. I was heavily involved in the buildup of troops around Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine. And so that too is a similar kind of question, is like, how do you show, what's the best way of showing this, and where things were, where they are now, how things shift. And so I did a number of stories that I worked on, where, we were showing that buildup and how things are changing, and is Russia bluffing or are they not? This was a Sunday edition of the Times where this map appeared. And then they've invaded, and early on we didn't have too much data to work with. And that it was, the early days, it wasn't, we knew where Russian troops were. We worked with a data set from the Institute for the Study of War. But as things changed, as we were able to do reporting, and other types of data became available, we kind of got a more granular picture, right? So it kind of went from being fuzzy to a little bit more granular. And then as like patterns emerged and we had a sense of where, Russian troops were and where they had been, that kind of thing, the forms on our maps reflected that, and it changed to kind of tell that story a bit more clear. And then we could also, tell even further in at particular cities and how the Russians were advancing, Ukrainian forces, where they were, and that kind of thing. This was a story of when Russia took over Kherson, they shut the internet down and rerouted it through Moscow. And so we worked with a data analyst who was able to see that and feed us that data so that we could visualize that as well. Really over a course of almost like a week, it was just, and then fed back. Okay, this is a different subject altogether, but the question is about the future of geospatial analytics. This is not a real map, but it's a map I did for the Adult Swim show Joe Parrott Talks With You. I don't know if you all have seen that. If you haven't, it's wonderful. Joe is my next door neighbor in Brooklyn. And anyways, this was the character in the show, Gene, was running for president, and this was his plan for the Omni Cooperative High-Speed Rail Network. And it was really funny when I posted this, someone's like, you can't put high-speed rail under the ocean. And it's like, I know, it was a comedy show. And honestly, I don't totally know what the future of geospatial analysis is. I have thoughts maybe on where things are going, but I'm certainly no expert in that. I certainly think the future of geospatial analysis is in this room. But I'll show some projects that are kind of maybe touch on that and kind of get to that a little bit. And maybe might not totally answer that question, but are maybe headed in that direction. This is a story. I have, I think, 2 more projects, and then I'll take some questions. After 6 months on working on the invasion of Ukraine, I got a bit of a subject matter break and thought about fog in San Francisco. And the thing about, well, okay. I shouldn't have led with this one, but that's okay. I'll come back to it. I think you guys might like this one. I think this is very, very cool. I wanted to understand why does fog happen in San Francisco? You hear about it, you have an understanding, yeah, San Francisco's foggy culturally, but why San Francisco? And so I set out through data, I like wanted to see it. You know, I talked to the experts and they tell you this, and this is why fog happens. I'm like, okay, cool. Like, can the data show me that, and that? You know, and so that was my task to myself, to show this to the readers, but to also understand it myself. This data set was so cool, in my opinion. We worked with a researcher, Dr. Rachel Clemshaw, and she took 25 years of GOES data and wrote an algorithm to look at every pixel and say, is that fog or not fog? So yes or no. And then provided us with 25 years of that data, which means you can do a lot of stuff with that. You know, you can animate it, but you can animate it over time, or you can flatten it and just say, here's all the data to get together. What we're seeing here is over the course of a summer, fog is most prevalent kind of in the south, the June gloom in LA. And then over the course of the summer, it on average moves up the coast. And by August, September, San Francisco is really foggy. Whoa, you know, that was really cool. But then I also wanted to kind of break down the elements of fog. I wanted to see it just in general, right? So this is a GOES animation overlaid on top of an elevation. And so you can kind of see it and how it interacts with, this is like pretty choppy, unfortunately, but you can see it kind of interacting with San Francisco. Oh, I'm so sorry how like choppy this is. Well, that's okay. But there were, okay, so there's a few elements to fog, why it happens. There's a high pressure system. There's the ocean temperature. Basically, the high pressure system drives winds down the coast and cool water rises to the surface and cools the air, and then fog is created because of that. And then temperature differences between inland and the coast pulls that air through the Golden Gate, which is a break in the mountains. And oops, sorry, let me go back a few. So there was those. I got the like elements of fog, and then I wanted to see it happening. And I'm kind of bummed that this is so choppy, I got to be honest, but so it goes. And this was this is more of a simulation. The data that supported this was like 2 cores, and so to really get a sense of like how fog interacts with the different areas in different neighborhoods, we ran a simulation. So we took wind speed, wind direction, that kind of height where fog kind of stops at, as well as the elevation, and ran a fluid simulation into this area. And you can kind of see it happen. You can see like parts of San Francisco kind of get covered and other parts not. And I thought that was kind of quite interesting. And then the final, or I think one quick one after this, but oh, I'm so kind of bummed that this is so choppy. Well, this is a story I did a few months ago about Starlink satellites, which are low Earth orbit satellites that SpaceX is putting up at a furious pace. It's kind of changed the course of the war in Ukraine, and as well as kind of the night sky in general. They have over 4,500 satellites in low Earth orbit now, and they put up about 60 a week, or they have the capability of them. And so I wanted to show that. And that's what this visualization is. I want to show the whole situation with satellites in orbit. And over 50, I think 53% of all active satellites are Starlink satellites. And this has happened in the last 4 years. And so this is an animation, a choppy animation, but showing the rise of Starlinks. We worked with a researcher who simulates Starlink coverage and to show that over the course of the war in Ukraine as well, how much that coverage has expanded. And then this was wild. There was a researcher who's kind of read all the like filings from 7 different companies who are also planning on doing this. And I'm forgetting 71,000 plans for 71,000 satellites in the coming years. Starlink has plans for about 42,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. And that was wild to visualize and to see. This was on the cover of the New York Times. And also occupied a center spread in the A book, which is a prime real estate. And you know, the kind of you know, the question is when you do something on the web versus print is like, how do you translate that for one? And so my feeling too was kind of like, I don't want to just show dots, right? I want to like, is there something else I can add to the understanding of how these satellites are moving, where they're moving, that kind of thing, what the general motion is. And so I included a 4-minute period of their motion in the print edition. This was the interior. And again, kind of translating that data. This was that kind of same 5-minute 5-minute time period. But again, since it was like static, I just showed the streams of their coverage over Ukraine. And then I'll end on this one. This is something I've been working on and is obviously in the news right now. But similar to Ukraine, you know, during war and conflict, the question is like, how do we know what's going on, you know, and like, how do we show what's going on? And so this is a damage assessment that we've been using from some researchers who use Sentinel-1 satellite data and had kind of update us. I think it's every 5 days. I think that's what it is at the moment. And you know, you know, that is something we do a lot, you know, is work with researchers, geospatial analysis researchers. So I'm not going to use this as a pitch for you all, but let me, but I was just say though that we work with people like you all the time, and you know, just feel free to be in touch if there's things that you're working on, and you know, think that might be useful or helpful, or you know, to things that we report on, or and that kind of thing as well. So we partner with people like you all the time. So I just want to thank you all for having me. It's really been an honor and a pleasure. And if you all have any questions, like just let me know. How are we doing on time? Also, I kind of talked a lot, but
I just wanted to start with saying it's a super cool presentation, and I have a comment and a question. The statement you said in the beginning about making things just to make things, that's very big to me. Like there's like a lot of different things that I do, and that's something I'm gonna keep in mind when I'm like working on stuff. And additionally, my question is like, what's your like what tends to be like what ends up being your workflow? Is there like a fast turnaround for like a lot of the visualizations, and like how do you like collaborate with like, let's say, like, is it like a lot of the times is it like the data provided for you, or is it like do you have to like find a way to like scrape the data?
Right. Yeah, great question. And sorry to answer with like it depends, but but sometimes it is provided to us, right? Sometimes there's a novel data set like the 3D wildfire I showed, right? That was like a researcher who has this data set, and like we were in contact with them and we use that. But I would say a lot of the time it's us doing some kind of data reporting in a way of this thing happened, what data is available, and then kind of figuring out what's the best data set to use for that. And like the fog piece and the different parts of fog that I was like that was a big part of that story too, because when you're animating, right, you're like you have thousands of frames, and that's like thousands of files of data and of like really huge data. And so that was kind of the complexity of that was learning how to sketch with a terabyte of data. Like there's this, it's like the clunkiness of data and then the nimbleness of wanting to like get ideas out and see if they work and that kind of thing. So I would say generally it's kind of on us to find data that we want to work with. And then sometimes it's just like we are doing the reporting itself to create data sets. So for like the COVID tracker, the Times, what they did very early on, generally something like that would come from the CDC, but that wasn't the case at the beginning of the pandemic. And so the Times decided to devote resources to scraping data and compiling that data set themselves. And the White House reached out to the Times for that data. Like that became a kind of a standard data set for COVID in the United States. So, and then in terms of like workflow and that kind of thing, we yeah, I think the more I do it, the more kind of workflows I have ready. So if I know that there's going to be maybe some elevation, I have a Blender file that's kind of ready to go. And I know where to get my elevation data and what I need to process it to get there. It gets really interesting when you're working with teams. We have colleagues in Seoul and in London. And so, for instance, in Ukraine, the Ukraine war, or the current conflict in Israel and Gaza, we are also working with our teams around the world. And from like just this pure GIS perspective, that's like challenging, right? Like passing along geo files and coordinating them, everything needs to be aligned. You don't know what's going to happen too. Like, so there just has to be this inherent flexibility, as well as some rigor to kind of, and there's multiple people working on things and different times. Like it's a real interesting question, and one that I think as a graphic designer spend a lot of time thinking and helping out with the department. Yeah, so and that's kind of what I like about the Times too. A lot of the maybe innovation that happens on the desk is really behind the scenes, and like how we collaborate, and a particular way we chop up satellite data so that 5 of us can like look really closely versus one of us looking at a gigabyte geotiff or something like that. So I think that's what always was kind of interesting to us too. It's like not just what ends up on the page, but how we got there. And I think that's like that is always what blows me away.
One more?
Are there any ethical consideration for all of this data, especially with reporting and visualization? Do you have to consider some ethic for what you have to, like the type of data you use and how you report them?
Sure. You're talking about, did you say the ethics of? Yeah. I mean, that is a huge responsibility, you know, for me and for our team, because the reader might not have access to the data set, right? And so that is a huge responsibility for us to feel good about the source that we're working with. That feels like the responsibility, right? Is choosing the data set that we trust. We understand the methodology that it was compiled with. We believe in the methodology that it was compiled with, and we feel comfortable publishing it and attaching our names to it too. But because of that fact that it's, you know, by us visualizing it, that kind of abstracts that data, the original data set and the data form that it came in, and obscures kind of inherently what that data is. And so I don't know how I could say how we do that, but it's this, it's just on par with the words we write, the facts that we put into print and online. Those have to be verified and have certain editorial standards. It's like just the same thing with the data we use, because because it's that important, and it has to be right. It just has to be right. I personally, I have to attach my name to it, and millions and millions of people see it, and, you know, it goes into print, and that's a million impressions it's made. You know, it's like, that's a huge responsibility that weighs on me a great deal. So I don't know. I hope that answers your question. Okay, thanks.
And I do not have question. I do have just a comment. Impressive presentation and visualizations. And talking to Dr. Supak, I learned your intro to GIS course was GIS 510.
Yeah.
Offered prize. So welcome back. You are our alum, I think.
It's true. Yeah.
That's fine.
Thank you so much. I find these visualizations so beautiful, creative, yet so informative. And I wondered how you balance having that space for creativity and exploration with working under a deadline, working with a team, and while having high accuracy journalistic standards.
Yeah.
Like, do you sleep?
It's really funny. I think you described it very well. You know, that soup, you know, that you just described is really what I'm grappling with all the time. I would say in general, keep pretty normal hours, honestly. I'd say over the last 2 weeks, that's not the case. When a huge world event like this happens, it's all hands on deck. But we keep pretty decent hours at the times, which I appreciate. You know, you know, we all have things that keep us interested in something, right? And for me, I kind of come from the world of experimental aesthetics, and so that is the thread. I like to thread that needle of what can I get away with, you know, aesthetically, while it also being bulletproof, accurate, you know, and accurate and clear. And I'm not making wild stuff that is unintelligible, but it is the challenge for me, and kind of maybe what gets me excited about this is, what can I get away with aesthetically? And but, you know, to the earlier question too, do I believe in this data set? And am I guess the other part of that question too is, someone is devoting their professional career to this particular data set, whatever it is. And so I also feel entrusted with that. And I have a great level of respect for that data too. So I also, I feel a bit like a caretaker of that that's entrusted to me, and putting it on a kind of a world stage too. That's a huge responsibility. And something I just like don't take lightly. And at the same time, I have my own like the things that keep me interested. You know, and it's challenge. It's the challenge also of working at fast pace. And how can I do more in a shorter amount of time? And so the more I do this, I get my workflows down, and then it just kind of becomes a little bit of a challenge too. Of you know, like let me just show you. Like I think the Turkey map is like one I'm really proud of on deadline. Right? That's like I think it's like a very like beautiful visualization. The I just have to mention the surface area of those circles correspond to the magnitude of the earthquake, but you know how like the earthquake scales logarithmic, right? But so that is also baked into the surface area of these circles. So that was like 7 o'clock, you know, on deadline. My boss comes back and it's like, okay, wait, but I do the surface area correspond to the magnitude and the logarithmic scale, and you're just kind of like, that is a lot of math, but we're going to do this, you know, you know, and like, I don't know, sometimes I'm just like, I just feel like this weirdo artist that ended up here and being like, oh, wow, I have to do some really intense math to get this done. And it has to, you know, it has to be accurate. I don't want to issue a correction that happens and, you know, it's not the end of the world, but it's not something I like. So, anyways, I think you described it well. It's all of those things, and in the most public, one of the most public places that you can imagine. And so, like, how do I just try and I try and let my work be my work, and then when the laptop closes, find some balance too, because it's a very difficult job, and can the content of which can be harmful. And so I also take care. I like take a lot of time to take care of myself, because some of the stuff can be pretty heavy. So yeah. Any other questions?
Well,
We've
unfortunately,
out.
we
Yeah,
ran
yeah,
out of
yeah.
time, but I echo everyone's thoughts. Thank you so much. This was an engaging conversation. Please remember that tomorrow we have a studio, 2 p.m. Yes, 2 p.m. Jordan Hall, 1214. Scott will be leading in a studio to discuss the process, his creative process. And if you are in the College of Design and want to talk with Dr. Supak about a GIS, intro to GIS, take the opportunity. Otherwise, thanks everyone.